Everyone's a little broken and everyone belongs. In the Jewish mystical tradition, the Kabbalah, the Kabbalists, they tell of the origin of the world involving a moment when God made clay vessels and filled them with divine light to make space for life to emerge, for creation to emerge. But the vessels were fragile, these clay vessels, and when they landed in creation, they shattered, scattering shards and divine light everywhere. And the purpose of humankind, the Kabbalists teach, is to find and gather these broken pieces to help heal the world. Tikkun olam. Tikkun olam, the teaching of known. All these broken pieces. We've inherited a world full of broken pieces. I think it's always clear, but maybe even in more stark relief than usual this year. We've inherited a world full of broken pieces, and we'll pass on such a world to those who come after. What is it for us to do? What is it for us to do, intones the Jewish prayer. What is it for us to do? This marks this year the 400th anniversary of Pilgrims landing at Plymouth Rock in that storied little boat, the Mayflower. 400 complicated, messy years, full of, among other things, the cultural genocide and actual genocide of indigenous peoples of the land, replaced by the saccharine myth of the noble savage. Today's scholarship leads us to understand that the story of those first pilgrims and native people they met, that myth of the first Thanksgiving that most of us learned, the beloved caricatures of pilgrims and Indians, had very little to do with what happened in the fall of 1621. It wasn't, in fact, until 1841, that the Thanksgiving story as we know it was told, closer to our time than that original meal. And in fact, it was a Unitarian minister, Reverend Alexander Young, whose writings we have first promoting the myth of those pilgrims and Indians in 1621. Our spiritual ancestors, like the rest of the dominant culture, seeking to tell a comforting tale out of a tragic history. The historians have been understanding more and more how the complexity of these times evolved and when myths emerged. Historian David Silverman last year published a book called "This Land is Their Land: The Wampanoag Indians, Plymouth Colony, and the Troubled History of Thanksgiving." And he describes that the myth of Thanksgiving casts the Wampanoags in 1620 as naive primitives, awestruck by the appearance of the Mayflower. But he says they were nothing of the sort. In fact, every step at their interactions was informed by their knowledge of past European ships that had visited their shores and left behind a wave of enslavement, murder, theft, and mourning. He describes in the late autumn of 1621, those surviving Plymouth settlers, 1 year after they had arrived, gathering to celebrate the fact they'd made it through their first year in the colony. A festive meal was underway when Wampanoag leader, who we know as Massasoit, but Usamekin, arrived on the scene quite unannounced with maybe 90 men, some 90 men, more than the total population of Plymouth itself. And indeed, fortunately, he writes, they did let down their guard, these two groups of wary men. And both sides feasted together for 3 days, topped off by a gift of 5 deer from the visitors. However, far from being a feast between friends, he describes, the temporary détente between the two groups involved tense, ongoing political calculation on both sides. As it later turned out, the alliance was not between war and peace, but who would be sacrificed for whose gain. And he just goes on to describe how that temporary détente gave way to 50 brutal years of conquest and colonization, that meal of 1621 largely forgotten, an untold story until a country striving to hold on to ideals of liberty and equality sought a balm for its sin-sick soul when President Lincoln proclaimed the holiday in 1863. So much to grieve. And that's why many indigenous traditions name this Thursday a day of thanksgiving, have called for a day of national mourning. So much has been lost, people and languages, a relationship of respect and mutuality with the land, with other living beings. Been reading a book by a botanist, Robin Wall Kimmerer, scientist and poet of the Potawatomi Nation. She writes in Braiding Sweetgrass about a very different kind of relationship our modern culture engenders, different kind of relationship with one another, with all living beings, with the land, than those of pre-colonial indigenous nations. She says modern capitalist societies, however richly endowed, dedicate themselves to the proposition of scarcity. Inadequacy of economic means is the first principle of the world's wealthiest peoples. The shortage is due not to how much material wealth there actually is, but to the way in which it is exchanged and circulated. The market system artificially creates scarcity by blocking the flow between the source and the consumer. Grain may rot in the warehouse while hungry people starve because they cannot pay for it. And the result, she says, is famine for some and diseases of excess for others. We know this, right? The very earth that sustains us, she writes, is being destroyed to fuel injustice. An economy that grants personhood to corporations, but denies it to the more than human beings, by which she means so many other forms of life, more than human beings. This is a Wendigo economy. Wendigo, an ever-hungry monster of greed and selfishness from the mythologies of those indigenous nations that speak the Algonquin languages. Monsters of greed and selfishness born of the proposition of scarcity. Ever hungry, consuming life, famine for some and diseases of excess for others. Many, especially in our California culture of feel-good spirituality, have sought to replace this scarcity mentality with an understanding of abundance. You've heard people talk about abundance. And while I understand the impulse, I have to say that flip has always rubbed me the wrong way. From scarcity to abundance. Do we have to run right past enoughness? What would a culture not of scarcity or abundance, but of enough look like? In one scene in Braiding Sweetgrass, Kimmerer describes the last remaining 9 elders who speak her people's language, gathering at a conference to offer classes in the Potawatomi language. She describes them entering these 9 remaining fluent speakers. None of them walking entirely unaided, most on walkers or in wheelchairs, at least with a cane. Sitting together in one room, speaking together. She imagines that day not too far from now, when all 9 will have passed on, and with them a language thousands of years in the making. She remembers a moment when one of them tells a joke in Potawatomi, and the others laugh uproariously. And she thinks about how that joke, what will happen to that joke when the language dies. She describes the scenes. You've probably heard the scenes of missionaries, the forced schools, the schools that Native American children were forced into, had their mouths washed with soap or worse for speaking their native tongue. Languages forcibly removed, intentionally destroyed. But it's not only that joke that we lose. She describes the grammar of animacy in her people's language. In English, most of our words are nouns. We're a noun-oriented language. It's maybe 70%. But not so in Potawatomi. The words are only maybe 30% nouns. The vast majority are verbs. And she talks instead about the grammar not of nouns, but of animacy. She describes it like this: a bay is a noun only if water is dead. When bay is a noun, it is defined by humans, trapped between its shores and contained by the word. But the verb, wikwigama, to be a bay, releases the water from bondage and lets it live. To be a bay holds the wonder that for this moment the living water has decided to shelter itself between these shores, conversing with cedar roots and a flock of baby mergansers, because it could do otherwise, become a stream or an ocean or a waterfall, and there are verbs for that too. To be a hill, to be a sandy beach, to be a Saturday, all are possible verbs in a world where everything is alive. Water, land, and even a day, the language a mirror for seeing the animacy of the world, the life that pulses through all things, through pines and nuthatches and mushrooms. This is the language, she says, I hear in the woods. This is the language that lets us speak of what wells up all around us. This is the grammar of animacy. Calls, I think, this grammar of animacy for a different kind of respect in our relationship to the more than human world. To bow to the sovereignty of the selfhood of other beings, to move from I-it relationships in the terms of Jewish theologian Martin Buber to I-thou relationships. What if that were the underlying logic of the language? Those things that have life, that have animacy, and those do not. And the things that have life and animacy include the beach, the bay, the stone. The challenges we face are so great, we can become overwhelmed. This loss so profound, we cannot possibly heal all the wounds we are aware of. May this grammar of animacy, this respect for aliveness, may it remind us that simply in our living, we are enough. We cannot celebrate in the ways we're used to this year. We don't have soup to offer in this virtual service, and yet our children and youth and teachers have made a beautiful retelling of a favorite story, and it is, surprisingly, enough. We cannot gather, as many of us would like, around big festive tables crowded full of far-flung family, and yet we still call and Zoom and cook family recipes, have a moment of connection and poetry with other members of our church, and somehow it is surprisingly enough. The weight of a nation's tragic challenges weighs on us, and we are helpless to stop a deepening political rift that scares us to the bone. And yet we still gather funds to care for those among us without homes, and we show up at council meetings and demand civic action and get them to purchase buildings and provide houses. And yes, there is always more to do, but it is also surprisingly enough to do what we can this day with these people. What is ours to do? The Jewish prayer of Tikkun Olam asks. To heal the world, the people answer. Not to finish healing it, to arrive at some perfect place, but through the action of healing, to remember we are enough. Kimmerer says, action on behalf of life transforms. Because the relationship between self and the world is reciprocal. It is not a question of first getting enlightened or saved and then acting. As we work to heal the earth heals us. In this reciprocal relationship, we find we are already enough. We say we inspire joy and justice in an imperfect world. We aren't looking for a fully healed world. The goal isn't somewhere out there, a perfect state of wholeness we can never hope to attain. No, we act to make a difference because we love this imperfect world, not because our acting will make it perfect. We act to make a difference because we grieve at its suffering and because we are grateful for its gift. We act to make a difference because we are not nouns, but verbs, part of a great animacy of life. We must measure our enoughness, not by the differences we succeed in making, but in the acting. Not in what is accomplished, but in the aliveness of action. And so I want to invite us to make another kind of sown soup this year. I'm going to try an experiment. Jeanette is going to put a link in the chat. I'm going to put a QR code, one of those funny little things you can look at with your phone on the screen. And here's what you can do. You can either click the link or you can use your phone with the QR code, or you can just type your answer into the chat. And then we're going to have a little image, a word cloud of all our actions, all that we do, a soup of words for all that we do to make a difference. I invite you to put things large and small, the phone calls, the food for a neighbor, the political action, a stone soup. postcards and mobilization, homeless, money people, volunteering, neighbors, food, singing, music, love, advocating, listening, giving, donating, playing, forgiveness, hotlines and groceries. May this nourishing soup, this good and hearty, this soup made of life, may it be enough. May it be so. And amen.